Without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker tonight. Has anyone ever read Scuba Diving Magazine? Right? Well, that was his first child. Is that older than your kids or about the same?
Yeah, it's a little older than my kids.
Okay. So Willie started that, and he's an industry legend because he started that. He is he created Dima's Go Diving Now Pool tour in the 2000s, and he's the producer of the longest running global diving marketing business survey called the Cline Report, which is published every quarter globally. And he also is very active in the diving community worldwide. And he's on the, you're the president of the International Hall of Fame for Scuba in Grand Canyon.
That's
So
correct.
he's very well connected in the industry. And so please give a warm welcome to my publisher, my colleague, my hero, and my friend, William Cline.
Thank you very much, Gil. And thanks, John, for inviting me. And Ken, it's nice to see you again. Ken was on one of our podcasts. I typically don't speak to consumers. And the only reason is that most people don't know I exist in the industry because all the work that I've done for the last 4 decades in the diving industry has always been to support the industry or various companies or tourism boards and so on. So I'm kind of like Gil in his life, the man behind the scenes that you don't see on a typical daily basis. But thank you again for having me. I really appreciate it. John, you want me to go ahead and share my screen?
Yeah, go ahead and share.
Okay, hopefully you're seeing my screen.
Yeah.
Great. So again, thank you for letting me be a part of your little get together tonight. Dive clubs are the lifeblood of the dive industry, and I'm so glad and pleased to be able to speak to you all tonight and talk a little about my life that has really all been inspired by a family of the Cousteaus, which many of you, of course, have probably been also inspired. I'm going to take you on a journey. It's not just really about my life, but some of my experiences and how they've kind of interwoven with the Cousteau family over the last 4 decades. But before we get started, I do have a question for everybody. Does anybody know why a lobster doesn't like to share?
Why?
They're shellfish. Okay. I had to have one joke. Okay, come on. Yeah. So don't worry. I got 250 slides, which what you told me you had 2 hours, I think you said, right, Gil?
Yeah. Thanks a lot.
No, I think I'm probably done in 30 to 40 minutes at the most. But you're welcome to stop me and ask questions. I don't see you in the way I have my configuration. So, Gil, if someone raises their hand or something, you have to let me know,
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah, let's hold all the questions till the end, and people who are watching from home will put them in chat, and people here will raise their hand. Thanks, Willie.
That's great. No problem. So I kind of have a simple mantra. Everything I have done in my life in the diving has been to teach, protect, and inspire the next generation. If we don't inspire the next generation of divers, your kids, your grandkids, your cousins and nephews, we won't have an industry. So it's very important that we as divers constantly are thinking of ways to reach out, and this club is an excellent way. You know, we all can't be at the beach every weekend diving, but we certainly can talk about it through efforts like this. I actually was I'm a 5th generation Californian, and when I was about 5, my family moved to the Midwest, southern Missouri, actually, and so I don't remember seeing the ocean growing up as a child, other than just on TV. And in our little farmhouse where we lived, we had, you know, the typical 2 or 3 channels, and one of them was PBS. And every Sunday night, we'd all gather around a TV and watch the undersea world of Jacques Cousteau. And I remember at the time feeling very, very connected to it and thinking someday I'm gonna experience what it's like to be underwater. And you know, Jacques Cousteau had a very famous saying. He said, "Once the sea casts its spell, it holds on to um, you forever." And it is so true. And it took me many, many years to get certified after that. But we moved to California when I was 12, back to California, I should say. And was having your typical tough time of fitting in. I got beat up on the streets a couple of times, and we lived in a nice neighborhood in Yorba Linda, which is, Orange County. But I just didn't quite have my feet underneath me. And we were driving by this dive shop on Yorba Linda Boulevard called the Aqualung Center, and they had a window sign up for $89, learn to dive. And I remember begging my dad, many for weeks if you could just go in and find out about information. And he was smart enough to know that I needed something else to do. So he signed me up for a class when I was 13. I didn't get certified till I was almost 15. It took me that long. I had a terrible time clearing my ears. I think more of it was nerves than anything. But as because I'd spent so much time at this dive shop and gone out for so many different weekends where I couldn't go out and clear my ears, I kind of got to know the owner, Don Himes. I got to know the different staff that worked there. And unbeknownst to me, my dad approached the owner and said, "Hey, if you'll hire my son for $1 an hour towards buying his gear, I will pay you the dollar an hour." Now, I didn't know this actually until several years later, but so I had, a job at 13. I was the only kid in junior high that had an actual job, and I worked every evening after school, and on the weekends. And back then, I swept floors. I filled air tanks. We didn't really have certification programs for regulators, so they taught me how to service all the regulators. So I serviced all the rental gear. And before I was 16, I was doing everything. And eventually, I became a dive master. And when I turned 16, the owner of the shop, for my birthday present, gave me the keys to the shop because I was legally old enough to put myself on the insurance, and he could go home early. So it was a really sophisticated operation there, but the Aqualung Center, I ended up actually selling it later for the owner when I got in the real estate business in Southern California for a while. But I felt like I was on hallowed ground. Cousteau was one and the same with Aqualung. And growing up to be able to work there were only two concept Aqualung centers in the country. One was in Fullerton, California. The other was out in New Jersey, someplace. The concept never really took off, but it was an incredible experience that taught me so much about the industry. There were so many lessons learned about, scheduling. And when we sold the store 3 or 4 years later, I remember finding a pair of fins that were from the opening week he had bought the shop or started the shop. There was things like no rotation of stock, and it was probably a lot of examples of what not to do well in retailing. But it was really some really incredible lessons. I never forgot one day I was filling tanks. And we had a guy come in with a Scuba Pro tank. And, I felt all kinds of tanks, didn't really matter to me. But the guy who was filling his tank had an Aqualung sticker on his tank. And these guys almost had a fist fight in the shop trying to decide who was better, the better brand, Scuba Pro or Aqualung. And I was shocked at this emotion being poured out by these divers about their brand loyalty to each of those individual brands. And that was kind of probably my first marketing lesson, you might say, of really understanding the true power of branding. And that honestly started at the Aqualung Center. So I'm going to jump forward a few years in time. We ended up moving back to the Midwest. My family did, and I went back with my dad. We were involved in the real estate business together, and I never lost my passion for diving. Went and became a dive instructor down in Fort Lauderdale, and came back. And I was the only instructor in a three-county area in southern Missouri, so I did all the open water classes. I certified all the police officers, all of the sheriff's departments. I did everything, and even founded their water rescue unit because I had nobody that could go out and help find these poor people that got lost or whatever. So I became a dive instructor in the Midwest, and I called it rocks and fish diving. The visibility was usually about as far as you could stretch your arm out, and it was. But it was a wonderful time. In fact, my dive shop, my business was called Table Rock Jacques, in homage to, of course, Jacques Cousteau. So one weekend, one week, a bunch of buddies that I had certified had an RV, and they borrowed it from their parents. And me and 4 or 5 guys took a trip down, and we dove all the springs of Florida and went down into Fort Lauderdale and stopped at where I'd been certified, a company called Pro Dive, and as an instructor. And went out on diving, and went down the Keys. Ended up coming back, and I got a call about 2 months later. And as I recall, it was like in November, and the dive shop owner, a guy named Greg McKay, he said, if you get tired of those Florida winters, why don't you give me a shout? So my wife and I, Patty, we talked about it. Like, do we stay in Missouri? And I really wasn't happy in the police department. And I did love the teaching diving, but it was incredibly seasonal there. And so we kind of did the Beverly Hillbillies thing in reverse. We loaded up all of our dive gear and everything, and I drove to Fort Lauderdale and walked in. And at the time, the dive shop consisted of a husband, a wife, a dive shop manager. And turns out I was the only instructor because I was replacing the one that just got bent on the Mercedes, one of the wreck dives, and could never dive again. So they didn't tell me that, of course, when I coming down back then. But it was an incredible experience. I think I worked for probably the first, I don't know, I think it's 2 or 3 months without a day off. And I threw up every day at work for probably the first 2 months. Even though I had a lot of experience on the water in lakes, it did not translate to the ocean as I thought it would. But I stuck with it. And in 87, I believe it was, or 88, 87, or 89, sorry, there's right there in front of me. I went to Patty headquarters and became a course director because the owner, the guy in the bright orange shorts there in the photo, Greg said, I got big plans for this company. I got something I want to do. We're gonna start doing instructor training here, and I think we got the best location. And so he hired, I went and got my course directors. Came back and he hired a gentleman in the red cap, some of you might recognize, named Alex Sprilsky. He actually lived in Southern California, worked for Patty for many years. And we both were the two course directors that started their IDC programs. And when I left, they were doing about 250 instructor candidates a year, which made them at the time the largest instructor training facility. And the first thing that Greg asked me to do after I left, he said, "Would you mind doing some contract work and going to some of these other countries in Latin America to do instructor programs?" So I taught not only throughout the Caribbean, but I did the very first PADI instructor programs in Brazil and Colombia and Venezuela. And back then we had no materials in Spanish. Everything, the only thing that was in Spanish was the open water course. So everything had to be translated. Everything written and everything said had to be translated. So the courses were very long and arduous, but it was really interesting to be part of something opening up entire countries for diving. And now most of those countries, the people that are the movers and shakers, either own the businesses or own the shops or the manufacturing plants, wherever it might be, are all past students of mine. So it's kind of cool to see that whole progression happen. And one of the interesting things that happened when I worked at ProDive was there's we needed, when we're getting ready to start up our instructor training program, we need a site to be able to take people diving for the instructor course. But then we wanted, Fort Lauderdale is a very vacation place. We wanted to be able to take them on like an underwater tour, and we couldn't really find a site that had kind of a big sand bowl is what we were looking for. So Bill Cole, which is the boat captain, and I went out, he's the guy in the white cap in the center of that photo in the back, went out one day on our day off, and we spent a couple hours. We had a glass bottom boat that we could open up. So we were going along the reefs and we just couldn't find anything. And Bill finally said, "Willie," he says, "I'm exhausted. We got to go. I can't be out here all day." So I said, "Let's do one more slow pass as we head back into the cut." And sure enough, we came across this site. I said, "Stop, stop, Bill. This is it." And I jumped in the water with my gear. And sure enough, it was an exact giant bowl shaped sand ring by reef all the way around. And I said, "Bill, this is perfect. We can sink down lines here. The people can go on a little tour after we're doing with their instruction." And he goes, "Great. You finally got your way. We're going to call this Willie's Way." And I said, "Yeah, right." He said, "No, you watch. It'll stick." And sure enough, that's the name of an actual dive site that thousands of instructors have since been certified on in South Florida. So I did get a site named after me, but I didn't have to die at least getting that occurred. One of the things that I learned along the way at ProDive was I never really set out to be in the marketing or advertising world. I was always thought I would stay in the instruction. I was their training director. But out of desperation, the owner's wife, which is the lady in the striped bathing suit right directly to your right, down below next to me, her name was Lauren. She was a bit of a fashion person, and she knew design. She knew what looked good, but she didn't know really how to do it. She says, "Would you be willing to help me create a campaign? I think if we advertise this program in Skin Diver magazine, we can really sell a bunch of classes, bring these people down." And so we created my first, I guess you would call it my first ad campaign. And the guy in the fluffy hat on the very far right, the safari guy named Nelson Moore, was our boat captain. And he dressed up in a safari outfit with one of the other staff members from the shop. And we took a picture, and the headline was Adventure Guaranteed if you went to ProDive to become an instructor. Well, they ran that campaign, I think, for a decade or two, and was very successful. But it was the very first introduction that I had into really advertising and marketing in the diving industry. And the last thing I'm going to say about ProDive was one of the course directors that we hired as an extra. Sometimes we got classes that were so large that we had to have a third course director, was a guy named Harry Averill out of Northern Florida. And Harry is a genius when it comes to Macs and design. I'd never seen a Macintosh computer, didn't know really what it was. But he kind of took me by the hand and taught me, hey, this is the program you use for page design and layout. Back then it was PageMaker. And he said, this is the program you use, which is still used today, Illustrator, and kind of went through some of the different programs and really spent hundreds of hours literally teaching me how to use these tools to do desktop publishing. So I ended up doing all of their materials, all of their marketing materials, all of their everything that was sent out. And I didn't know it, but I'd actually gave myself somewhat of a degree in crash course in design. So I was visiting my brother-in-law and my sister in Dallas about, I want to say this is in 89 or 90, 1990, just early 90. And we were sitting in a hot tub one night at their apartments, and he says, you know this desktop publishing stuff, and you know how to design stuff, right? And I said, well, yeah, I did it at ProDive. I said, I know how to use the tools. He says, well, I work for a software company, and we're thinking about starting our own line of products, and we have don't know anybody that knows that design world, and we need to do some flyers and some advertisements, and would you have an interest in coming to Dallas and partnering with my company, and we'll kind of stake you if you're interested in putting in the time for a reasonable amount of money, and we'll start a partnership, and you can be our in-house advertising agency. And I said, well, again, it was one of those moments like that happened before. We went to Florida, and my wife looked at each other, and we talked about it. And so I said, what the heck? I had a great run in diving. I love diving. It was so fun. But I figured, well, diving must be done with me, because now I'm going to go into the software business and using some of these newfound skills I'd learned at ProDive. And so I came to Dallas and set up my little shingle. And the first thing that happened was a resort down in Bon Air called me, and they said, well, now that I heard that you're doing this kind of work, would you do a flyer for us or an ad? And so I had a few kind of things I was doing, but I figured I was really pretty much done with the whole diving industry, at least from a professional standpoint. I didn't envision you could actually make a living doing what I do. So I went in doing software work and doing advertisement for their products, which turned out to be vaporware, which in the software development world means it never really made it to market. But I got a call from Harry Averill, the same guy that taught me how to do the design things at ProDive, and he says, Willie, he says, have you ever been to the DEMA show? And I said, no, I've never gone. I can't really afford to go. And he says, well, would you like to come to the show? I'll pay for you to come to the show if you'll hand out subscriptions for the 4 days of the diving industry show. And so if you're not familiar with DEMA, it's the once a year event in our industry where the entire global market of diving comes together for 4 days and does business essentially. And so he said he had a contract with DEMA producing a magazine that they had, a trade magazine at the time called Marin Scuba. And so I said, sure. So I flew to Vegas, and I was standing in the aisle handing out these subscription cards. And this lady walked up with a name badge that said Rodale Press. And I immediately recognized it because my mom had always subscribed to Prevention magazine, and I was familiar with them on the newsstands. And she said, do you have any information on the diving industry? And I said, well, yeah, I have a little bit. I said, but I said, I don't have it here. Says, but I know two people here that know everything there is to know about the diving industry. I guarantee they'll tell you whatever you want to know. She says, well, I'd like to get some research and so on. And I said, well, let me take you to the executive director of DEMA, a guy named Bob Gray. So I walked up to his office, knocked on his door, the show office. And I said, Bob, I said, you got a minute? I'd like to introduce you to Laura Donahue. Willie, I have no time. I'm late for a meeting. I don't care what it is. I can't talk right now. And runs out the door, right next to me. And this, of course, this representative from Rodale. And I turned to her and said, I'm really sorry, Laura. I said, But the office next door is the PR company for the dive industry, and her name their name was Marion Rivman. I said, and she's here. So I knocked on the door, same exact thing. Marion, you got a minute? This I don't have time. I'm late for a meeting. So she rushes by me. They clearly must have been going to the same meeting. And I turned to her. I said, look, here's my card. I said, I would be happy to send you what I have. I said, as a course director, I have a very thin file on research that we kind of get as course directors. And I have a few other studies that have been done in the past. Blueprint for Growth was a really old one that was done in the 90s. And I said, or early 80s, actually. And I said, I'll send you what I have. So I got back and says, well, they called me, gave me their FedEx number, and I sent the information to them. And then 24 hours later, I get a call from the executive vice president of the sporting division of Rodale Press out of Emmaus, Pennsylvania. And he says, Mr. Cline, he said, would you be interested in coming to Pennsylvania? We'd like to meet with you and talk to you about maybe helping us with this project. I said, well, first of all, I don't know what project you're talking about. Second of all, I can't afford to even buy an airline ticket. He said, no, we'll pay for a ticket. And he says, we'll have you picked up at the airport. We'll put you up in a hotel. Don't worry. He says, we'll send all that to you. And so the next day via FedEx, tickets come in the mail. And I was on a plane and he sat down with me and he said, well, we've been looking at the dive space for a long time. He says, but we think now might be the right time. Skin Diver Magazine was the major dominant leader at the time. And he said, but we don't know anything about the marketplace and we can't find any research on it. And Laura tells us that you actually have some research that you sent us and we looked it over. It's pretty thin, but would you be interested in helping us gather a lot more information on the diving industry? And I said, well, sure. So I left with a list of 25 questions they had asked. They wanted me to come. He says, you go back, you think about how much you'll charge and call me up and let me know. And then, we'll take it from there. So went home, talked to my dad. I said, Dad, how do I do that? How much do I charge these people? He says, well, whatever you think and just double it. So So I did, and I called him back up and I said, "Well, I'll tell you what, I'll do it for this amount per hour." I said, "I think it's going to take me X number of hours to do some of this stuff, but honestly, his name was Chuck McCullough, no relation to the writer." But he said, "I don't know how many hours." I said, "Because this stuff's never been done before." He says, "Don't worry, just send me a bill every week. We'll pay you on a weekly basis." I said, "Okay." So we started collecting information on the dive industry, and it was really quite fascinating because no one had ever surveyed dive shops and consumers about some of the basic things. They wanted to know everything. They wanted to know if the open water course was a barrier to entry for people entering the sport. They wanted to know how people reacted to doing resort courses. They wanted to know everything they could about what a dive shop, how it functioned, where their profit centers were. They wanted to know how they were marketed. And so they embarked upon about 15 different studies that I produced over the course of a year for them on every aspect of the industry. And at one point, I had my mom, my dad, my best friend, Harry, again at the time, he came to work for me actually after this project, and a few other people, and we went through the entire industry, and they said, well, this is really great. We now understand what we want to do, but how do we get lists in this industry? I said, well, there's only three places that have lists in this industry. Back in 1990, I said, Patty has the biggest one. I said, they typically don't share it. I said, Dan has a really big one too, but they don't share it. And I said, there is a third source, but it's expensive and it's complicated to get. And he said, well, let's start with the first two. So we did a couple of surveys among dive shops and instructors all over the country. And we asked them, if how would they feel if Patty teamed up with a new publisher to produce a new independent scuba diving magazine. And 85% said we don't really care as long as it's a good quality magazine. And the same thing happened with Dan instructors at the time. So we went and met with John Cronin out at Patty, and separately Peter Bennett at Dan. And the first question, of course, they immediately scoffed and said, no, no, no. And I said, well, would you like to see what the industry thinks about the idea? And of course, I did the whole mic drop thing where we dropped this nice report on their desk, and both of them had the exact same reaction. They're paging through it, and they said, how did you do this? I said, well, we just called up Patty Shops and didn't tell them we were asking about Patty, but we just asked him these questions. And long story short, they both ended up doing a list exchange deal with Rodale that got them a very, very large list to start. Then the third list that they needed was They said, these are great, but do you have any other ways of getting lists? I said, the biggest source of list in the entire world is dive resorts because every resort has to have a liability release signed by a diver. So back then there wasn't the issues with confidentiality like there might be today if you were to do something similar. So we created a program where if a resort would send us their boxes of liability releases, we would data entry those and send them back in a floppy disk that they would actually have a mailing list electronic for the first time. And we'd pay them 25 cents a name towards ad credit for them to the magazine. So they launched in 1991 with the most successful magazine they'd ever had in the history of their publication, with 77 advertisers in the initial issue. Um, and of course, a lot of it was credit from this advertising exchange program, but they generated in the neighborhood of 250,000 email or mailing addresses. So of course, they had a very successful launch, and they battled it out for many, many years with Skin Diver magazine until eventually Skin Diver demised, and now the only magazine, consumer magazine, at least the largest besides Dan's Alert Diver now, is Scuba Dive Magazine, which of course is owned by Patty. But it kind of put me on the trajectory because once I'd gotten into the industry, people started giving me calls, and um, I before I had a chance meeting with Jacques Cousteau, I got a call from a guy named John Englander, and he said he owned a company called Unexo in the Bahamas, and he was working with the Bahamas government. And he said, "Would you be willing um, to compete for the Bahamas diving account for the government?" And I said, "Sure." And I competed against 4 or 5 agencies, and we were immediately awarded the contract that I held until 2020. So it was a 30-year deal. I've worked with a lot of governments throughout the years. But one of the highlights was 1997 was actually meeting Jacques Cousteau. And I don't know if any of you out there have ever met him. He did do some shows from time to time, but it was certainly a poignant moment in my history, meeting, my hero, the person that, really I felt got me into this entire sport was his undersea world of Jacques Cousteau. And I've been so fortunate that from that experience, I was able to meet his son, Jean-Michel Cousteau. And Jean-Michel is a great guy. He lives down in Santa Barbara, very active diving. He has a resort in Fiji still. And so he hired us to do some marketing work for his foundation, the Ocean Futures Foundation. We created their logo and did some early marketing work with them. And we actually had him as our spokesperson for the scuba tour, which would go on to become the Be a Diver Now pool. And the concept came from I'm a pilot, and I was a pilot at the time. And Mark Young, which owned Mark Young, and Jerry Beatty had uh, Dive Training Magazine and Dive Center Business Magazine back in the early 98, 99. And they had said, there's this big show we do every year up in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, where we bring in thousands of like 50,000 pilots from all over the country. He says, wouldn't it be cool if we just set up a pool and, we gave people a free introduction dive? And so we got the Bahamas to pay for it the first year. And long story short, we did it a couple different years. It was the most successful pavilion, excuse me, at the entire show. And it became such a cool idea that one one of the shows, I think it was the third show we went to, Mark Young sat me down and he said, "Well, have you thought about just taking this concept on the road?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He says, "Well, just go around to state fairs and stuff like that." I says, "If it works here, it'll work anywhere." So we cobbled together a bunch of the industry manufacturers, training agencies. DEMA was a huge supporter, Patty, NAUI, SSI, almost every major manufacturer chipped in. And we bought a truck and a trailer and hired the guy that you see right there in the center of the photo with the on the left there. It's Dave Riedenbach. He was a local dive shop owner in I'm going to say someplace, Green Bay, I believe it was. And he was looking to do something different. And he said, "Yeah, I'll sign on." So for about 3 years, we created what was called the Scuba Tour. And it went around to state fairs, NASCAR events. I mean, it was amazing. We averaged about between 10 and 15,000 people a year would go in the water and try it. And it was incredibly successful. DEMA actually purchased it from me the week before 9/11. So it was a sad event, but perfect timing from a business standpoint. And then eventually they got it going and back on the road. It took a while, and it ran right up until COVID. And COVID unfortunately killed it. As we all know, you couldn't really have any saliva or anything like that. So it just kind of stopped stopped, but it probably over the course of it, they probably have had well over 250,000 people introduced to diving. So it was a very cool program. And it was great to have Jean-Michel as our spokesperson for the tour, and he was very heavily involved in it. So my story crosses three generations of the Cousteaus. Jacques, of course, and then I'm going to speak in a minute about his lovely first wife, which most people don't know, was Simone. And then his son Jean-Michel, and then we've been really fortunate to have Fabien, which is Jean-Michel's son, and of course Jacques' grandson, write for a magazine. And so he's continuing that legacy of being very involved in diving, and he's actually working on a project right now to build an underwater habitat. Kind of similar to what his father had done with the conch shelf concept a long time ago, but for I think it has a lot of space applications and things like that. So there's a great legacy between the Cousteaus, and it seems like there's been an interweaving between their history and our history. And then in the fall of 2024, 2023, I was asked to compete for a contract with the Cayman Islands Department of Tourism. They're looking for an executive director for their International Scuba Diving Hall of Fame. And if you have ever been to Cayman or ever going to Cayman and you're on Grand Cayman, you have to go check out their museum. They have an awesome diving museum. It's a small museum, but it's got some really cool stuff in it. A lot of it's dedicated to the Cousteaus in there, but there's a lot of other early pioneers. And they are the only tourism board I'm aware of in the world government that spends the money they do on diving. They, in fact, in meeting with the executives in the government on my first onboarding trip, they said diving started our tourism business. It's no longer the primary business here, of course, but it started, and we remember our beginnings. And so they every year induct between 4 and 5 people to the Hall of Fame. And so my first job last year was to help try to find a new class. And I'm really pleased that they were willing to take a very, very bold step and do an all-woman class for 2025. And the very first early pioneer was Simone Cousteau. And Simone, I'm going to come back to her in a second because she's got a fascinating history most people don't even know about. But the Women Hall of Fame is also, we do induct organizations. A young lady out of Hong Kong that does incredible environmental work in the Hong Kong harbor, Heidi Hu. Most people are very familiar with Stuart Cove, but very few people know that Michelle Cove, his wife, helped build the business with him for 3 decades, 4 decades. And we were honoring her. She was the marketing brains behind that operation. Anne Hassan, most people know Wayne Hassan from, of course, The Aggressor, but Anne was very much like Michelle. She was the woman behind the man that was really responsible for the marketing for many, many years and just recently retired this year. And then Rosemary Lund is probably one of the most well-known technical divers in Europe. And she's never really been recognized for her amazing accomplishments as a woman and in a technical world, no less. So we're really proud this coming September 20th that you guys are all invited to. It's in Grand Cayman. It's a beautiful ceremony the government throws. It's a beautiful dinner, and we honor these great pioneers. So Jean-Michel, first wife, Simone Cousteau, and I'm going to do a shameless plug for a book that I'm going to talk about a little later on, but Jean-Michel wrote a book. And in this book, he describes his very first scene of his very first dive as a family. And when Jacques Cousteau invented, of course, the aqualung in the early 40s, 43, they were the first diving family. So he describes them going out. They lived in Marseille, and they would go out through the back gate of their house that literally went down to the ocean. And they, as a family, would all go diving together, which would put Simone as certainly the first woman diver on the Calypso, but probably arguably maybe even the very first scuba diver ever. We don't really know because it's not really documented, but Jean-Michel did document it in his book. So that's where I have actually nominated her 3 different times for the Reaching Out Award at DEMA, and I'm still going to continue that process because I think she should get that as well. But it's a person that's kind of been lost in history because of, unfortunately, Jacques Cousteau divorced her and then remarried Francine, the current, and she's a widow now too, but she actually runs the Cousteau Society. So it's kind of a interesting situation there, but a great person. And so if you happen to have some time on your hands in September and you want to brave the hurricane season, come to Grand Cayman, reach out to me, and I'll be glad to send you some information. So since those years, I've had the luxury and the joy of helping a lot of people, a lot of different companies in this industry. I won't bore you with a lot of the stuff that Gil talked a little bit about it. I'm passionate for the DEMA organization. I've served for 13 years. I'm getting ready to roll off my term. And I challenge if you're in the diving business out there, you have a dive shop, you are qualified to run for the board of directors. It's a great experience. If you're in the diving industry in any capacity as a professional, you qualify to run. So I'd encourage you to. So in 2023, we had a problem in our industry. Because of COVID, we lost the only dive trade magazine we had, which was published by dive trainings owners Mark Young, called Dive Center Business Magazine. Great publication for dive shops. And unfortunately, they didn't make any sense financially to continue publishing it after 2020. So for about 3 years, our industry had no way to talk to the dive industry itself. So my wife and I embarked on an ambitious project in the fall of 2023 is try to identify every brick and mortar dive shop left in the United States. And we initially had the number somewhere around 850. We're up to 966. We know we're probably still missing about a dozen or so, maybe 20 at the most, but we feel like we've pretty much found most of them that are out there. And these are true brick and mortar shops. They have your traditional dive shop. So we created a magazine. I had some experience, as you know, from my early days. I've also done some work with Undercurrent in the past. And I've done consulting for most of the other magazines at one time or another, with the exception of Skin Diver. But so we launched this magazine as really a labor of love for the industry and a way of communicating. And one of the real highlights is finding Gil. And Gil reached out to us. I think want to say at one of the Long Beach show maybe last year. And as I always say, Gil was new to me, but he's not new to diving, and he's certainly an incredibly experienced writer. And so it's been a real joy working with many of the industry's retailers, and we have a lot of people that write for us. And if you are a dive instructor, or again, you're in the business of diving, reach out to me. I'm sure we can find a way you can be a part of the project. Then a few months, we also have two podcasts that we do. We do a monthly podcast every month. And that is, we have all the writers from the issue come on the show, and they talk about their individual articles. So it kind of brings it to life. And then we do a weekly podcast with the industry called, Marketing Minutes. And it's a business to business podcast as well, but it's really like today we just had on the representative from Tusa talking about all their new product lines and all that stuff. So, if you want to geek out and you want to see what's going on in the industry, check out the Marketing Minutes. They're really a lot of fun. They're only 10 to 15-minute videos each, but we do have a different company every single week. I think tomorrow we have Solomon Islands and another company out of Roatan coming on. So it's going to be a couple of great podcasts. So, excuse me. One of the beautiful things about my life in the diving industry has been, I call it the cross-cultural connections. And a few years ago, we're doing some contract work for Stuart Cove, actually. He asked if I would help him organize a trip to Kuwait. The guy in the pink shirt in the middle of the photo there on the lower right, that's Stuart Cove, and the guy in the white flowing on his would be to your right. By the guys in the black shirt is a guy by the name of Al Teki. And Al is part of the royal family of Kuwait. He's actually a nephew of the president of Kuwaiti Oil Company. And he's an avid diver and invited us over as their guest. And we came
I can't see your screen.
You can't see the screen?
No.
We can see it okay here.
We can see it.
Really? Okay. Maybe it's just our screen.
Well, too bad, because I'm showing a really cool video right now. The camel's running down the street. But so I don't know why you can't really see that, but
We can see it, Willie. We can see
okay,
it.
good.
You're okay in the main meeting.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So anyhow, the point is that we got invited to Kuwait, and we did this presentation with all these sheiks in this room, and afterwards we went to one of the local dive shops, and it was amazing not being able to speak the language hardly, and completely different culture in every possible regard, but we all had a really cool common bond. We're divers. And we are immediately accepted as family. And that's exactly what it felt like. We then left there and flew to Egypt for the day and then drove down and then took a second flight to Sharm el-Sheikh. And I don't know if any of you have done the Red Sea, but you definitely got to have it on your bucket list. It certainly is right up there with some of the best diving I've ever done. One of the cool things that we did if you get a chance to go to Sharm el-Sheikh, there is a dive town called Dahab. And Dahab, I had heard about. They have a famous blue hole there, and so the night we dove all day long in Sharm el-Sheikh. That's the photo of me right up there with doing the OK sign. That was on Ras Mohammed State Park there, or National Park, right on the Sinai Peninsula, which is just biblically very cool in so many regards. But they told us that well, they've applied for a permit to go dive Dahab the next day. They can only go there with a permit. And I said, why? And he said, well, because you're an American. We have to get a permit because you're American to go. And I said, okay. So we went to dinner that night and they got a call for somebody or an email said, yep, the permit's been approved. And I said, we'll meet at like 4 a.m. the next day in front of our hotel. And so we pull up and out comes this guy with a Mac 10 strapped to his back. And I'm like, what the heck? And they said, well, because you're an American, the Egyptian government has issued a secret service, equivalent of secret service officer to be your personal bodyguard for the entire day to go to Dahab. And I'm like, okay. And I thought it was kind of really weird. Well, it turns out the problem is that you have to go an hour and a half through, or excuse me, 4 hours through the desert to get to Dahab. And the danger is that these rebels will set up checkpoints to try to kidnap foreigners, specifically Americans, because they're worth a lot of money. And the Egyptian government didn't want to take any chances with me. And so, of course, I was completely harassed the entire time as the only person out of 12 in the group, but I was the only American that had his own bodyguard. And it was a wild experience. We dove what's called the hot tub. So you pull into this little dusty parking lot after seeing those camels that just went by a little while ago, and there's camels all around, and it looks like something right out of Raiders of the Lost Ark with these pillows all underneath sitting around people drinking tea and so on. And they said, hey, have some tea and figs or whatever while we unload the gear and load them onto the camels. And I said, camels? Yeah. So, well, you can't walk to where we're going to. You can, but it's a long walk. And we just load all the gear on the camels and then you can just follow along behind them. And so we went about a quarter mile or so away along the shoreline. And there was this big hole in the ground that looks like a hot tub, and it's about 100 yards or so from the ocean. And it is about the size of it's a large tub, about 20 feet or so. This hole is. And what you do is you put on your dive gear and you drop into this hole head first, and it goes straight down to about 90 feet, makes an L turn, and then goes under the 100 yards or so underneath the side of the desert. And you come out. And it goes into a tunnel then that goes another 100 yards, so about 250 yards or so, and you pop out on the side of a wall at 120 feet. And I thought, wow. And it was incredible. One of the most amazing dives of my life. In fact, one of the cool things about diving, if you ever get a chance to go to Sharm el-Sheikh, there's this dive site called Mike's Reef. And Mike's Reef is home to this one sea anemone that's right in the middle of this photo here that has bright red tentacles that glow at 100 feet. And it's really remarkable. You just went along, and at 100 feet, we all know the colors are gone. And this is this iridescent sea anemone I'd never seen before. So that was really an amazing experience. And the last little cross-cultural thing that I want to mention is 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 China. I had an opportunity to go do some diving in southern China. There's a place called Hainan Island. And Hainan Island is the Hawaiian Islands of China. It's about an hour and a half or so flight from Shanghai. And the reason we went there is the president of now he had told us all about this incredible dive place that had 500 dive instructors on staff. And we're like, really? So we flew to Hanoi. He arranged this whole thing for us. We go to this incredible resort. And sure enough, they did somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,500 resort courses a day. And they had 500 dive instructors on staff that got paid $1 a day and all the rice they could eat. And so we said, let's go through the experience. So Stuart and I suited up, and sure enough, we went out and actually did the dive and did the whole thing. And it was like going to Disneyland for divers. It was really quite remarkable. So Um, that is some of the cross-cultural experiences that I've been so fortunate to have. And I'm going to bring it back to one of my favorite things to talk about is, of course, we all love diving, and I loved hearing your dive stories at the very beginning. One of the I got the funniest and scariest and most ridiculous and most memorable, and I'm going to start with the funniest one was Stuart Cove and I have done a lot of diving together. In fact, that's us there. I mean, Hanine Island a long time ago, which that goes to the most ridiculous dive. I'll go back into a minute, but so we were down at Galapagos on Peter Hughes' boat way back in the day, and we were diving this seamount that was kind of an advanced dive. There was always a strong current there, and it just came right up to, I think the top was somewhere around 60 or 70 feet, and they said just known for, of course, lots of hammerhead sharks and so on. So we jump in the water, and I noticed that almost immediately I had so many sharks around me. I mean, they're coming up to me and they were almost nudging me, and I'm like, I was looking around. I'm like, what the heck is going on? No, they weren't that close to anybody else, and they were start swarming around me. And I'm like, this is the craziest thing in the world. What is going on? And then I noticed Stuart next to me was laughing so hard his mask was filling up with water, and he swam over to me and he popped open my BC and he'd stuffed breakfast sausages and rolls in my BC before we jumped off the boat from breakfast that morning for the and bread and everything else, pull it out, and of course all the fish went crazy and the sharks went crazy and all that stuff. But anyhow, that was probably my funniest, I should say. I think my most ridiculous was in China also. That was Stuart and I. We were honored guests. They wanted to take us out to the best diving they had because we'd done the little resort course and some sort of a, I don't know what you want to call it. They felt like they had to show us the best they had. But the problem is there had been a typhoon that was coming like 2 days before, so the water was terribly murky and messed up. And so they take us out on this boat, and myself, Neil Watson, and Stuart, and we drop over the side with a guide, and we realize we can't even see our fins. There's visibility, couldn't have been 18 inches the most. I mean, it was just, we're swimming along and you bump right directly into the reef because you can't see anything. And we go on this sort of dive, and we were kind of really kind of laughing more than anything. And we come up, and the dive guide was so proud. He said, wasn't that amazing, amazing dive? So I'm like, yeah, that's pretty amazing. And I think my scariest dive was probably in Fort Lauderdale. And we'd finished an IDC, an instructor training course, and I was down on the wreck with some of the candidates. And, they're instructor candidates, so they're pretty confident. And I always dove with a small group of them. And I saw something off to the side in the sand, and I thought somebody had lost a weight belt. So it was a crystal clear day and really strong ripping current, though, coming from the north, which is unusual for there. And so I swam over to look for the buckle, and it was just a shell that reflected like a buckle. And I turned around, and the boat was gone. And the Mercedes is 100 foot. It's a big wreck. It's 200 something feet long, as I recall. It's huge. And here I just swam right off the port side, and I turned around, and it was gone. I'm like, and I'm about 95 feet of water. And so I start slowly swimming at the direction I know I came, and I get where I should be. The wreck should be right here, and it is not here. Now I'm down to like maybe 800 pounds. I'm like, okay, I gotta start headed up. So I start heading to where I thought would be the bow of the ship. But I mean, I'm here, I can see the sand everywhere. I got down to 300 pounds of that. This is so ridiculous. I am going to be so embarrassed. I'm going to surface, and a course director is going to have to get rescued by my own dive boat because I did something so stupid, which was swimming off entirely on my own. Well, long story short, right before I think I got to maybe 300 pounds, I glanced to my left, and sure enough, I saw in the distance the down line to the ship. I was just parallel to it, but about 200 or 300 feet off of it, and came up, and I was pretty shaken by that because I mean, it doesn't matter how many dives you have. It's the basics that sometimes can really hurt you. And that was just a stupid mistake that, a diver should never make, no matter how much experience you have. I'm almost done. The last thing I want to talk about is my favorite dive. Growing up in Southern California, I loved the ocean, the dives off Laguna Beach when we had those beautiful, clear winter days, or we had the Santa Anas that would just lay down the water and make it absolutely still. I was doing one of my classes, and we went off to do Scottsmouth Cove, which is now part of Crystal Cove State Park. But back then, you just parked at the top and you walked down the million steps. And it was one of those perfect California days. The water was flat calm. There was almost no surf. The visibility was 100 feet if it was 10. And that was back when they still had all the kelp forest. And we crossed over this little berm of rocks and went into this beautiful kelp forest, much like this photo that you're looking at right there. And I never forgot the sunlight coming down through the kelp and thinking, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my entire life. And all the dives I've done, which is well over 5,000, I have never seen anything even close to that, that experience, that beautiful Southern California day. So I'm going to leave you with a commercial and an assigned reading. Most people don't really think about how new our sport is, by the way. Tennis was invented in the 1500s, give or take. Skiing, 1850, when it became a popular sport. Same with bicycling. Surfing, 1800, but dates back to even the 1200s in the Polynesian islands. Diving was invented in 1943, patented in 1948. If you want to read the most amazing walk through the history of scuba diving for the eyes of a Cousteau, is Jean-Michel Cousteau co-wrote this book with another gentleman by the name of Daniel Paisner. It's called My Father the Captain, and it is a recount of his life growing up with his father and his mother. And it is amazing. That's where I came up with the story. That's where I found the story of Simone, even knew that's where I found that she existed. So if you're all lovers of the ocean, which I know you are, go out and find this book. Barnes & Noble has it. Amazon, of course, everybody does. But it's a great book and a great read. And it's a very different perspective because it's not from Jacques' perspective. It's from his son's perspective. So I'll leave you with that. Again, I think as an industry, we should be, and as divers, want to teach, protect, and inspire the next generation. And I hope that you all do that and keep that in mind. And as I love to close with, the only good suit is a wetsuit. So does anybody have any questions? I'm going to turn off my screen sharing.
Okay, before we get any questions, I just want to say to Willie that my first dive ever was a resort course in Grand Cayman. And so it has a very warm place in my heart. Why don't you talk for a minute about high touch for the print media, as you discussed the other day on your podcast?
Yeah, so there's a lot of research that's coming out right now. The Harris Poll just did a study not too long ago, a few weeks ago, actually. And there's a couple of other studies that have come out that are showing that there's a technology fatigue or a digital fatigue that we're seeing, especially among the younger consumers out there. And there is a longing or desire to go back to touch. And that not only translates to print, but it translates to in-store dive shopping visits. Now, mind you, the research also shows that 66% of anybody that walks into a dive shop on average, because it's a general consumer number, has already researched that product they're looking for online. So there has to be that seamless purchase between a dive shop, in-store sales, and online clicks is the ideal. But there is still a resurgence right now. 78% of Gen Zs and millennials believe that print magazine is more influential to them than digital campaigns. 70% are along the lines of they make their brand decisions from something they see in print versus digital. Doesn't mean that digital is going away. We all know that. But the reality is there is a resurgence. In fact, some of the luxury brands have started reintroducing catalogs again. This is probably a little bit of a crass example, but Playboy's publishing again after being unpublished for many, many years in the print version. So there is a resurgence out there for magazines, and I'm hoping that will be a good for all of our dive magazines, because we all can't be in the water every day, but boy, we can sure read about it.
Right. Thank you. Okay, any questions, Carol?
I'm curious what year your Dahab experience happened. In what year?
Let's see. I want to say probably 2016, 2017, something like that.
Okay, thank you.
Might have been as late as, you know what? I take it back. It was 19. That was right before COVID.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a quick question.
Okay.
Is there diving for women in Kuwait and Egypt? Wow.
So funny story. One of the projects I was involved in was a Guinness Book of World Records attempt by a Kuwaiti woman to break the underwater endurance record. And she had selected Nassau, Bahamas, Stewart Cove to do it. And we set up an underwater studio to broadcast the whole thing live. It was really an amazing effort. Unfortunately, she ran into some technical issues because wasn't experienced with using a dry suit because she didn't think she needed a dry suit. But we all know that it doesn't matter how warm the water is when you're spending, 48 hours underwater, you have a huge hypothermic issue. But yes, there is actually a resurgence of women that do dive in Kuwait. I can't speak the geopolitics of it. I just know from my experience now, the event that I went to, there were no women divers at, but I was told by the dive shop owners that there are women that dive there. And that's where the woman that tried to do the world attempt came from. Her name was Reem.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
And she was trying to raise awareness for women in diving, actually. It was a cool project.
All right, John, are there any questions on chat?
Oh, I don't know.
Okay.
2014. Okay.
Well, John's looking for
Ken has one.
Bradley. Okay.
Not a question, an invitation. We've been celebrating Blue Friday in the Marin Scuba Club for the last 5 years.
Yeah.
I'd like to invite you to come and dive with us. I'll hold a place for you at Point Lobos.
I have dove all the way up to the Channel Islands. I have never dove north of that. And I
Point
would
Lobos is where it's at, baby.
I would love to. I would love to.
All right,
That'd
I
be
got a
awesome.
spot for you. All you have to do is get here.
The only challenge is that time of year is right after the DEMA show. The DEMA show ends on the 15th, and we go into production on our November issue, actually after the show. So I know my time's at a real premium just because of the production. But you know what? Let's talk as it gets closer, because that would be something I would absolutely love to do. I'm not afraid of cold water.
Yeah.
I'll
And,
save a spot for you. And
Willie-
the only good suit is a dry suit.
There you go. That's true. That's true in cold
Willie,
water.
through Willie, Ken and I were interviewed by Greg Holton Scuba Radio
Twice
the
now.
last
Yes.
2 years. And,
Yeah.
and Willie is helping us promote Blue Friday 5.0 because I'll write a column for his magazine.
Yes.
This
We
coming-
love it.
And by
we
the
love
way, Nico Marine in Palau is going to cooperate with us.
That's great. Now we're still hopeful that we can get some real traction with that program.
It will.
The challenge is that there's a Blue Friday out of Canada that's an environmental movement, and that's been a little challenging from trying to get, say, DEMA behind it, because DEMA is such a global organization and they have to be careful of all the other countries involved, kind of thing. But it's a cool thing, and I think as from a grassroots effort, we should just continue it, and we're going to help promote it in the magazine, of course.
Yeah,
That's great.
I'll be talking about it at DEMA too.
I'll save a spot for you.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
If anyone wants a free subscription to Scuba Diving Industry magazine, go to the website scubadivinindustry.com and sign up for a free subscription to his monthly magazine.
I'm going to warn you, you got to be a real geek if you're not a professional to want to read it, but it's some pretty cool stuff in there.
Yeah.
The podcasts are fun too. If you just want to know more, like we had the rep on, like I said, today from Tusa, and it was really cool hearing them talk about what makes Tusa different. We had the president of the dive division from Garmin on talking about some of their new technology they have coming out. We've had, you mentioned FogX, that lens company. We had that guy on talking about his technology. And by the way, this is not a commercial for him. He sent me a sample because I was like, does it really work? I did a shore dive in Curacao that was amazing. And then I did another dive in Bimini with the sharks and tiger sharks, and it was amazing. Same mask, same lens, no fog, nothing, not even spit anything. It's just really remarkable. I wouldn't be surprised if he gets snatched up by one of the big manufacturers that builds it into all their masks.
Yeah, he hopes to either be bought or expand his product line because he's a radiologist. He's looking to create a lens big enough for a shield that doctors wear. Because
Oh, interesting.
Mhm, yeah.
Any other questions?
Bradley.
Yeah, the ocean is being so challenged by so many environmental issues over the last 40 years. How have you watched that the decline in what you've seen in various places you dived and
So
Yeah.
that's a really good question. And there's two factors to that. And there's a lot of arguments about who's responsible for what. But, in the ocean, we had El Nino, which occurred in the very most dangerous one, the first one that really started a lot of the bleaching event. I believe I want to say was sometimes in the late 90s, early 2000s was the first El Nino. And it's a global warming current that occurs. And it's a cycle. They have the El Nino and the El Nina that occur every few years. And that particular one was a really warm one. And in the Caribbean, and a lot of the corals were affected because it didn't kill the coral, but it killed a little tiny algae that grew on the coral. That there's an animal that ate it called a diadema. A diadema is almost like a baby spine sea urchin, but the diadema played a critical role in cleaning the reef. So their food source got killed off because of the heat, and as a result, the cleaners of the reef died. So we had this huge coral bleaching event that has still stretched on for 20 years or so from that event. So there's things like that that have occurred that may or may not be man generated. I'm sure that you could find probably a complete split in this entire audience in that regard, but that was a naturally occurring event that did affect our oceans. There's a couple of things that I will say. I am very encouraged by some of the coral nurseries. I had an interview with someone recently that they planted 300 coral stems down in Curacao, and they're taking and they're working. They're having incredible rapid growth. They're doing some programs like that in the Keys that in our generation, our children's generation, may actually make a big difference. But I think the key here is, yes, we all should protect the ocean. We all should be environmental stewards. We all should be blue in everything we do, of course. But got to remember that if a person gets certified tomorrow and they dive in, I don't care if it's La Paz, Acapulco, Hawaii, or the Bahamas, and they put their face in the water, that's the first time they've seen that reef. They don't know what it looked like 25 years ago. They don't know what it looked like 10 years ago. They only know what it is right now. And they have the excitement that you all had the very first time you saw that coral reef. We tend to get brazen because we think we remember what it was like. And that's a challenge. So, I always tell instructors and dive shops, the most damage you can possibly do is have a dive instructor on the back of your boat saying, or a dive guide, oh, you should have seen it 10 years ago. Who wants to hear that? So, we're huge when it comes to environmentally oriented as a publication and everything we do. And that's why we've supported Gil's Blue series that he's been doing on bluing our dive business, because there's so much that we can still do within the industry to, it'd be wonderful if we could start seeing alternate fuels being used in dive boats, for instance. But that creates a massive logistical problem to get those fuels to very remote places in the world that have difficult distribution systems that it is. So, but there are things that we can do, I'm sure, that will help.
Great. Thank you again, Willie.
Thank you.
You're welcome.